Hello. Um, I've been thinking a lot about this debate between Jordan Peterson and Kathy Newman because it's become a real talking point for those of us who really take issue with identity politics and more specifically Western third wave feminism. Okay, this exchange between them has been analysed, it's been put into memes, all the rest of it. Um, but does make some very interesting talking points. Firstly, regarding Jordan Peterson, if anything, it's increased the number of fans that he has. One thing I find remarkable about Dr. Peterson is the fact he has the patience of a saint. This is a man who has been vilified, who has been shouted at in his face by regressive people, and how he manages to keep such calm, such serenity is quite incredible. Um, the more I hear of Dr. Peterson, the more he seems to pitch to reason and common sense. And it's hard not to have a lot of respect for him. I'm not going to say I absolutely worship him, uh, because I wouldn't say that about anybody. I'm sure there might be one or two areas I don't entirely agree with him on, but that's the point. Is I think he really rationalizes arguments well. He really pitches to reason, and he's got a lot of expertise. He knows what he's talking about. That's why I think he has seen a number his fan base grow. Kathy Newman, on the other hand, it doesn't need to be said, came across as loud, obnoxious, basically everything that was ugly and divisive about modern feminism. Her whole narrative was, "It's because I'm a woman." It's pathetic. Um, anyway, it got me thinking about, and not just this, but the always never-ending battle of the sexes that we see in the media. Got me thinking about what is the best way, really, for those of us who are critical of the movement to approach Western modern feminism. Well, firstly, we need to be clear what it is. I really think that contemporary third wave Western feminism is a very toxic movement, and I've no time for it. Um, I think it's important when we're talking about feminism to be clear that feminism as a concept, those of us who really do believe in equality would not be against feminism as a concept. I've nothing against the concept of feminism. Um, it's the belief that women are equal to men. Now, if you believe in equality, that's a completely harmless idea, and that shouldn't be a threat. And there were very important movements in history that are absolutely morally justified. The suffragette movement and second wave feminism also had many valid points. I do believe, though, that third wave feminism is a different beast, and I believe that it's become essentially a hate movement. My basis for that is that when you have a situation where half the human race is being vilified constantly by a movement, then it's very difficult to see it in any other way. Now, what they always say is, "We don't hate men, we're not against men." But I think the onus is on them to prove that that isn't what their movement's about. Because it tells women that they're perpetual victims, and it tells men that they're perpetual controllers and um, architects of privilege, which is a totally flawed argument. I mean, to cite one example on this gender pay gap dispute, one thing that is rarely brought up that should be brought up is that some of the most high risk jobs are occupied by men. Majority. I mean, if you look at oil rigs, if you look at coal mining, if you look at roadworks, those sort of high risk jobs are overwhelmingly done by men. So equality campaigners rarely mention that. But I think one big factor about third wave feminism too is a power dynamic. It's profoundly influential. At least that would be seem to be the case to me in media and politics. Politics, well, feminists say, oh, but the majority of MPs are men. That doesn't mean anything because the equality of opportunity is absolutely there. Um, I mean, you even have in the UK, there were controversies over women only shortlists. In my view, discriminatory, but that's they claim that the idea was to get more women into parliament. In Canada, there was backlash against Justin Trudeau from those of us who believe in actual equality, because he famously said, oh, I've got a 50-50 cabinet because it's at the time 2015. So putting virtue signalling before meritocracy, which is totally incompetent. I mean, it was utterly absurd. But the power dynamic is definitely with third wave feminism. I mean, like I say, in politics, because you get a lot of men who have to toe their narrative, basically, to be electorally successful. There's a few exceptions, Trump and a few others, but certainly for a very long time, it's been the case that they have to virtue signal to the feminist movement to to basically get far, and that's really telling. So the fact that it's a majority of men doesn't really mean anything because a lot of those men are using the feminist narrative. Um, in media, absolutely, it's very very dominant because if you get a feminist writer or a feminist campaigner and she's interviewed by the BBC or Channel 4 News, she's going to be given a free ride. Very very rarely are they going to be put on the spot and said, well, how do you explain this or how do you defend those double standards? It's extremely rare that journalists will actually do their job and hold feminists to account for their sweeping statements, and I find that deeply frustrating. Therefore, it falls on others. And unfortunately, when others encounter their opinions, they're pigeonholed as being against women's rights, which is totally what I find deeply frustrating is how third wave feminists think that they have a monopoly on what is equality, on women's rights for that matter. Simply calling themselves feminists doesn't mean that they actually promote the ideals of liberty that, excuse me, of equality that were originally promoted by feminist ideology. So just because a woman calls herself a feminist doesn't mean she has a monopoly on what is equal. And that's a problem. The media will not hold them to account for the most part. It's deeply, deeply frustrating. But that's where we get into this whole power dynamics question that I want to bring up. How do you deal with them? If you are a man in public life, and I'm saying in public life because at the moment I'm a private individual, right? I'm not famous. I'm not in the public eye. But if I were, I don't see my views radically changing if I happen to get into a high profile position. So if I was a politician, if I was a writer, if I was some sort of public figure, how would I deal with this if I was in a debate scenario? Well, there's a lot of things I think need to be recognized to deal with this, and I've thought carefully about this. Firstly, depends on the sort of feminists that you're communicating with. If it's the aggressive type, i.e., Kathy Newman, the first thing you need to recognize is you're not going to get through to them. They're not going to be converted because they have this inbuilt battle of the sexes in their mind. Everything you say to them, they will look at you as a man. Because, like I said, it comes down to identity politics. They don't see you as someone who's disagreeing with me. They see you as a man, the enemy. That's their mindset. So you're not going to convert them. It's important to recognize that. Okay, so you're not going to convert them. Therefore, the pitch is not towards them. It's about people who are watching. It's about trying to convince the watching audience that you are putting forward reason. I think it's very important to remain calm. And this is perhaps an understated value. When you have people throwing out sweeping statements, when you have people churning out and regurgitating utter nonsense, I've just seen a little clip from Channel 4 after the whole Kathy Newman saga, where they were discussing how sexual harassment is defined. They had one feminist writer and two women who were pushing back against her. Now you would think that is balanced, but the feminist was getting a lot of free airtime. Christian Guru Murphy, like I say, there's a lot of virtue signaling from male journalists and male politicians. He was sort of sitting on the fence, but anyway, that's beside the point. I think it's extremely important to remain calm because when you have someone that is churning out utter nonsense, it is easy to lose your temper and say, "Well, that's just complete rubbish." You're demonizing half the human race. When you get feminists say things like, and that's very much what this feminist writer was doing. It's a power structure. Men have all the power. Men this, men that, men the other. There isn't a day goes by when the feminist movement isn't attacking men in general. So amidst that, it's very easy to lose your temper and say this is an ugly hate movement, right? Which it is, but I think it's probably true of debates in general. The person who remains calm, for the most part, this isn't always the case, but for the most part, they're the one who looks more reasonable. There are certain times when the person who loses their temper comes across as the more reasonable. If, for example, I don't know, you have a debate between a paedophile and someone who's campaigning for the rights of children who are being exploited. If that person loses their temper with a paedophile, most people are going to say that's a reasonable response, just as a random example. So losing one's temper isn't always a sign of losing control. However, for the most part, I would suggest in a debate scenario, it is very important to remain calm, especially when you have cameras on you, especially when you have a viewing public. One of the things that Jordan Peterson said, actually, he cautioned his supporters to always remain calm. It's a very difficult one because, I mean, when you had those aggressive, in that case, it was trans activists, violently interrupt aggressively interrupt his talk in the University of Toronto, where they were forcefully trying to shut him down. Not only did he personally remain very calm, his supporters did as well. And I think that is really, I'm not sure I entirely agree with what he said about always remaining calm. I don't think it's always the right approach. However, he was right to say that when the media captures something, they distort things all the time. So if you get, for example, a feminist activist who gets in your face and she's totally, or sometimes he, is totally unreasonable and totally obnoxious, if you then get angry, unfortunately, the media won't pick that up as a man's defending himself from this obnoxious man here. They will pick it up as aggressive man stands up to brave, independent woman. That's the sort of garbage that they spin, and it's actually rather disgusting how they do that. But anyway, that's why the power of projection is so very, very important. So remain calm. If you ever find yourself on Question Time or in a news studio or wherever it is so very important to remain calm. And it's not easy. I mean, if you're human, you're going to feel angry about the the double standards, about all the rest of it. That's a natural response. But it is important, I think, to remain calm because as soon as you lose your temper, I think it plays into their hands because it then allows them to say, "Oh, he doesn't like a woman speaking her mind." They get to spin it that way, and so remaining calm, remaining civil, I think is very, very important. It's not about putting on a false front. I don't think it's necessary to be overly polite, but being calm and keeping everything to just the subject matter, not personalizing it. That isn't easy, but I think that's very important. That's the first thing. And I think if you could do that, everything else is easier to handle. I think this can't be understated because I think if you lose your temper, it doesn't mean that you've lost the argument, but I think projection is very, very important because then it's not about right or wrong. The thing about temper, the thing about getting angry, it's got nothing to do with right or wrong. It's got everything to do with projection. And as soon as you lose your temper, unfortunately, the other person then gets the upper hand because they get to make you look like you're being irrational. and you're losing control. I think it's very valid to call out the double standards and very valid to say this is wrong and to point out, well, actually, they have the power dynamic in terms of the influence on media and politics, but remain calm. Hold them to account. This is extremely important. Don't give them ground. Don't let them churn out these nonsense statements without being challenged. Now they're not going to be converted. They're not going to listen to the reason, but the watching audience will. So call out the double standards. When they talk, for example, about men having all the power, point out the most powerful person in the country is a woman. Point out the fact that the overwhelming prison population is male. Point out that the overwhelming number of jobs held, uh, like I said earlier, high risk jobs are held by men. Point all those things out. Hold them to their double standards. I think it's extremely important because one issue we've seen with a lot of men, and I think this is actually, I think one reason that regressive third wave feminism has got to the extent it has is because men have allowed it to. We have given these man haters too much ground. So we need to reclaim a bit of that and say, well, actually, no, you're wrong. Remain calm, but just hold them to the double standards. What I would do is put them on the spot and say, okay, you say that you're all about equality. Please answer this question. Man and woman commit the same crime. Should she serve the same sentence? Yes or no? Now, if she's smart, she'll say, oh, yes, she should serve the same sentence. If she's an aggressive feminist, she'll try to change the subject. But push them on that. Push them on that. Pitch to reason. Well, this is important. If you go in with a narrative of playing their game, which is a battle of the sexes, then that isn't going to work because it will allow them to portray you as wanting to keep women down. Pitch to reason. So, recognize that there are areas that impact women. Recognize there's issues around the world that seriously impact women. So, talking about those things is no bad thing because it shows that you're not against women's rights. Even though that you know that you're not, it's so easy for them to portray you that you are. So, pitch to reason. Say there are areas that impact women. And incidentally, modern Western feminists are silent about a lot of those issues. So pitch to those issues, pitch to those things that do impact women. And that way, you're not totally polarizing, for example, women who might be sympathetic. Because I think there's a lot of women out there who are sort of in two minds about feminism. They certainly wouldn't endorse MRAs, but by the same token, they might be somewhat wary of feminism because they know that it has negative connotations. And that's a good thing, incidentally. It's good that it is now attracting controversy because I think most women are reasonable. Most women, when you actually ask them these questions, they will be reasonable. So pitch to reason. Um, Appealing to moderates, this is kind of closely tied to this, but I don't think all feminists are man haters. I think the man hating or misandry, to put it another way, is deeply entrenched in the feminist movement because there isn't a day goes by when male shaming isn't being done. I mean, every single day there is an article about how hard things are for women, etc., etc., and it's deeply frustrating. Like I said, because of that power dynamic in the media. So appeal to moderates. Those feminists, female feminists, who say, "Oh, but we're not against men. We recognize that there is male suicide, etc." Um, I think it's important to appeal to them and say, okay, we might find common ground on some areas. I recognize what you're saying about this. I want you to recognize what I'm saying about that. One of my criticisms of moderate feminists is that they certainly don't hate men. And one thing that they will always say is, oh, but we've got husbands, we've got brothers, and so on. Incidentally, I think it's not always a barometer of being reasonable. You have people who might get on well with ethnic minority people but still hold racist views. So that in itself isn't necessarily a barometer of reason. But I think that when you ask them things like that, they'll say, "Yes, I recognise that male suicide's an issue." They'll blame the patriarchy, but okay, at least they're recognising it's an issue, right? That's important. But what one criticism I have of moderate feminists is they are, in my opinion, far too quiet about the extremists in their midst. And they will say, oh, but they're just fringe figures. I don't think it is. I think that when you get movements like he for she, me too, etc., those are gynocentrist movements. I mean, me too has hugely underestimated male victims. That's why when you get, for example, a feminist writer that was just interviewed on Channel 4, she was talking about the power structure between men and women, which is why we have the sexual harassment problem. She was ignoring the fact that there are male victims as well. Um, so that's one issue I have with moderates. They don't call out the extremists in their midst, and I don't think they fully recognize that there is, from a man's perspective. I don't think they fully understand just how it comes across. Because from a man's perspective, every single day we are being shamed. Every single day it's about, you know, men are this, men are that, men are the other. So I appeal to moderate feminists. Please try and understand why feminism it isn't good enough just quoting the dictionary definition, because this is the go-to. Oh, feminism is just about equality. That's not good enough. Any movement is defined by what it does and what it says, not about the dictionary definition. And modern Western feminism is deeply divisive and deeply polarizing. It is. So, what I would say to moderates is I recognize you don't hate men. I recognize that you're probably a reasonable person, and we would probably have common ground in a number of areas. But I want you to be a bit more vocal in calling out the extremists within the movement and calling out the double standards within the movement. If you really are egalitarian, then recognize that there are areas where actually men are disproportionately affected by, let's call it sexism. Um, and one final thing, it's important not to play their game. I think one mistake that the men's rights movement makes is it's a little bit too dystopian in the sense that whilst they're right to call out issues that disproportionately impact men, like male suicide rates, like parental custody issues, etc., they're a little bit too fatalistic. They're a little bit too, the world is out to get men. Everything is bad for men. Everything is great for women. Um, that sort of black and white worldview is exactly what regressive feminists do. So in a way, they're just playing their game. Um, and the last thing I want to do is end up feeling bitter against all women because of the nonsense that regressive feminists churn out. So don't see women as the enemy. Don't see it as men versus women, because actually there are a lot of reasonable women out there who know that there's double standards, including women who call themselves feminists. So appealing to moderates and not playing the game of regressives is very, very important. I really do think that is the case, because if you allow them to present you as an angry man who wants to keep women down, they will win. They will win that projection, you know? I mean, the media at the moment is not being fair. They're not giving equal airtime. That's obvious. So you're not going to convert your opponent. The media isn't going to be fair. So, forget that medium and just think about the projection. The BBC, Channel 4, etc., they're not interested in being fair right now because their narrative is entirely influenced by feminism. But you know what? So I think sometimes, maybe, and I'm perhaps guilty of this, I give the media too much credence in terms of the power it actually has. On the surface, it can appear to have huge power, but if you actually look at the comments, when the BBC comes up with women are this, women are that, blah, 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 you will actually see a lot of people and not just men, a large number of women as well, who can recognize the double standards. So actually, what the public opinion is not necessarily the same as the media projection. And that's probably a very important thing to remember. It's something I should remind myself. Maybe it's one of my faults. I sometimes give the media too much credit. Like maybe I think they've got more power than they actually have. Maybe that's something I need to reflect on. But anyway, I think those are all very important things in dealing with this. If you ever find yourself on question time or in a debate scenario, especially in public, remain calm, stick to point, don't as hard as it is, don't personalize it, but do hold them to a point for their hypocrisy. Pitch to reason, recognize that there are issues that impact women. Um, appeal to moderates, but yeah, don't give them ground. Call out their hypocrisy and call out the issues that are not being discussed. All those things I think will resonate well. And also, don't be too fatalistic. Don't let them play the victim. I do think that when it comes to having level playing field, the media is not fair. That goes without saying, because journalists do not hold feminists to account. When you get, for example, someone from the Women's Equality Party, they're given a free ride, which is very, very frustrating. But that's the media for you. It stinks. The sort of inert biases that you see, it absolutely stinks. But that's just the way it is. So I think all those things are important to recognize. And I would also say be somewhat wary about totally endorsing certain men's rights movements because some of them, frankly, are not just advocating men's rights, they actually are holding some pretty unpleasant attitudes towards women in general. So they're basically playing the same game as man hating feminists. Some of them are perpetuating the stereotypes of boorish sexist men. Okay, so I think those are all points to consider. And believe me, I know it isn't easy. I know it is incredibly frustrating when it would appear that feminists, because when you're dealing with someone who's taking everything as a personal slight because I'm a woman, when you have someone who's going into combative mode, as Cathy Newman was, and the whole mindset is about what trying to rig you up as being the man who wants to keep women down, the worst thing you can do is play into their hands. So be calm, be civil, keep to point. And what you'll find is most people will actually, looking at the debate, will actually say, well, actually, he was being reasonable. And she or he, it could be a male feminist, um, are just coming across as petty and divisive and aggressive, which so very often is the case. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Those are just a few things to think about. But let's not give them too much power. Let's not assume they have all the power. Yes, they have a lot of influence in the media, and yes, they they're giving more airtime than their critics are, but it isn't that easy to dismantle their nonsense. It isn't that. I mean, it isn't that difficult. Excuse me, it isn't that difficult to dismantle their double standards. So do it. Hold them to account. Don't lose your temper. Hold them to account, and say, "I'm not against women's rights. I'm just against hypocrisy." That way, you win the ground. Don't give them the ground. And I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching.